As Edward's consort, there'd been little she could do, but with her son beside her, she could speak and act as the mother of the heir to the throne in the face of her husband's tyranny. She'd been waiting for her chance, and now she took it. With his son, Edward sent an instruction that his wife should return home. But Isabella had no intention of doing any such thing. And we know exactly the reason she gave. The manuscript of the greatest chronicle of the reign, the Vita Edwardi Secundi, is long lost, but its text has been passed down through the centuries. And here, in this modern translation, we can hear Isabella's voice speaking for the first time. Until now, she'd been a supporting player in the unfolding drama, but now she moved to the center of the stage as she replied to her husband with open defiance. I feel that marriage is a union of a man and a woman, and someone has come between my husband and myself and is trying to break this bond. I declare that I will not return until this intruder is removed. Isabella's game plan was to present herself to the world as a wronged wife. And until now, she'd seemed more than justified in doing so. But another player was about to enter the scene, who would change forever the picture the world would have of Isabella. Roger Mortimer was 38 years old, a soldier and a politician of skill and experience. He had joined the rebels against Edward in 1321 and escaped into exile in France. And within weeks of Isabella and Mortimer's meeting in Paris, rumours circulated that their partnership was more than political. There's tantalisingly little evidence of the private dynamics of Isabella and Mortimer's relationship, but it was clearly an all-consuming passion, not least because of the danger into which they'd precipitated themselves. Adultery, for a queen, was sin and treason combined. But for Isabella, there were no longer any safe options. With her knight at her side, and the most valuable pawn of all, her son, under her control, what move would the queen make? Isabella took a momentous decision. It was no longer enough to remove Despenser. She needed to remove her husband too. She intended to do something unprecedented in English history: depose an anointed king. Could she, as a woman, achieve this? She certainly couldn't do it alone. She needed an army. And how she got one reveals a great deal about the woman she'd become. Now she was an independent player on the European stage, and she arranged the marriage of her son to Philippa, daughter of the Count of Hainaut, who brought troops and ships as her dowry. On the 22nd of September 1326, at the head of 100 ships filled with soldiers, Isabella, Mortimer and Prince Edward set sail for England. When Isabella stepped onto the Suffolk coast, she was taking up arms against her king and husband with her lover at her side. She could hardly have been more openly defying the conventions of female virtue. And yet she wasn't met with outrage and vilification. Instead, she was greeted with open arms. While there was no alternative to Edward's rule, his people hadn't known how to resist. Isabella wasn't challenging him in her own name. She, after all, had no right to the throne, but in the name of their 13-year-old son, Prince Edward. He was too young to act alone, and so Isabella acted for him. And with the promise of a new young king and his capable mother, her husband's power simply melted away. Isabella might have been an unfaithful wife and a rebel queen, but she was also England's champion against Edward's tyranny. No she-wolf, but the saviour of her adopted country. When news of the Queen's triumphal progress reached Edward and Despenser, they were gripped with panic. They packed their saddlebags with gold and fled west, where they were captured, bedraggled figures in the Welsh rain. Isabella had Despenser brought before her. There's no question that she relished her moment of revenge. Despenser was hanged, then disemboweled and castrated when he was still alive. The supportive queen had been transformed into a very different figure. Now Isabella was acting as if she were a king, inflicting brutal punishments on her enemies. Which of course raised the question of what she would do with her own king. In January 1327, in a carefully stage-managed piece of political theatre, it was declared in Parliament that Edward had forfeited the allegiance of his people, and that now his son should wear the crown in his place. In just 4 short months, Isabella had achieved the unthinkable. She, a queen, had seized power to depose a crowned and anointed king for the first time in English history. To undo a coronation was no easy task. Parliament had given the act a legal gloss, but to make doubly sure, Edward was forced to sign his own abdication here at Kenilworth. Now the deed was done. But could Isabella rule in her son's name while her husband still lived? The new King Edward III was still just a teenager, so Isabella was running his government for him. But never before had England had to contend with the existence of an ex-king, alive and well, while a new king, or in this case a king's mother, ruled the country. Isabella had Edward imprisoned in Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. But she knew that while he remained alive, he was the obvious focus for any rebellion. Within a year, 3 plots to liberate him had already been uncovered. These documents here in Berkeley Castle give us a sense of the extraordinary difficulty of keeping an ex-king in custody. We can see here from the provisions bought for him, which included 280 eggs, or ova in Latin, in just 3 months, that at first he was kept in some comfort. But this account tells us of the reinforcement of the castle, with bolts and great bars and other ironwork, after Edward escaped from his guards in the summer of 1327. It was obvious how dangerous his continued existence was to the new regime. We can't know just how closely Isabella was involved in planning Edward's murder. By its very nature, his end was a grim business done in secrecy and shadows. His death was announced, but not explained, and in the absence of an explanation, rumour and speculation took its place. Legend has it that he was killed with a red-hot poker, thrust into his anus to burn his intestines from the inside. This violent detail was immortalised more than 200 years later by Christopher Marlowe in his play of Edward's life, when he called Isabella that unnatural queen, false Isabel. What's certain is that it was Edward's death, a murder that supposedly took place in this room at Berkeley, that sealed Isabella's reputation as a she-wolf. Just 30 years later, the chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker portrayed Edward as a Christ-like figure, betrayed and destroyed by a wife who was like the biblical Jezebel, a tyrannical and sexually corrupt queen manipulating her husband and son to impose evil on the kingdom. But these opinions were formed in hindsight. When Isabella knelt in prayer at her husband's funeral, she was still seen as the saviour of the nation. But though Isabella was a political animal through and through, there were limits to her political understanding. And now her overwhelming sense of entitlement began to blunt her vision. Like so many rulers before and since, she started to run the country for her own enrichment.